Okay. Sorry, I'm gonna just have to leave the meeting and come back in just to get the screen share to work. Sorry, I'll be right back.
Okay, so I just started recording after I introduced our keynote speaker for tonight, who is Sarah Rupert. And now Sarah is logging out just momentarily because she's having trouble with the Zoom program, and she's going to be back in a second. And meanwhile, oh, here she comes. Good.
Okay, sorry about that. It's what always happens when you update your software.
Uh,
Okay, are you able to see my screen there?
yes.
All right. So I'm just gonna get onto the play screen, and then hopefully that's all still okay.
Still good.
Seeing pretty pictures of birds and things.
I see a bluebird and a monarch butterfly.
And that is one of that is a piece of my art, if you're interested. So you may wonder what's migrating at this time of year, and it's birds, it's butterflies, and dragonflies, and even bats at this time of year. So when you come to Point Pelee in the fall, you get a really lovely mixed bag of things. And what I like about fall migration, I always find that it's a lot less hurried. If you've been to Point Pelee in May, you know that the pace can be pretty exciting and fast paced. And I always find that the fall feels a little bit more laid back, and it gives us time to really observe things and spend some time with some of the species. So you may wonder why Point Pelee, and really it is about location, and it's location in a few different ways. First off, it's the location just on the continent of North America. In general, we're almost smack dab in the middle of the continent. So when birds and other animals are migrating, we're often that route in the middle that they take. So if something is more an eastern species, they'll sometimes push over to us. If it's something that tends to migrate down the middle of the continent, we would see them, and then it also can have western species push into us a little bit. The other thing that's really important is our location around the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes can be a really big migrant trap, and that's because they're these huge inland, really like inland seas. These big bodies of water tend to trap migrants. And what we're seeing here in the fall as well is a lot of the migrants that we're seeing in September at Point Pelee are diurnal migrants. So those are birds that are migrating during the day, and they use shorelines to help them migrate. So really the Great Lakes just kind of funnel them all the way down into Essex County. And if they're following along a shoreline, they'll come right out to Point Pelee. And then the other thing out as well is that peninsula that extends out. Even when a bird's migrating at night, if they're out over the lake, as the sun's coming up, they're looking for a place to rest. So you may get a bird that's already started out onto Lake Erie, but the sun's coming up, they need to find a spot, and often the closest point they'll find is Point Pelee. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of why Point Pelee is so great. So let's talk a little bit about fall bird migration, because I know that's what most people are interested in, but I'm going to talk about some other migration as well. So in the fall, it's like I said, it's a slower and more leisurely pace. Because you're seeing the young of the year migrating, there's absolutely more birds around. Hurricanes and storms bring in rare birds, particularly in the fall. So this is when we can sometimes see some of the rarest birds that have been found at Pelee are associated with those storms in the fall. And the other thing about fall birding is it's more challenging. So while there's lots more birds around, they're not in their flashy breeding plumage. And that's where it can become a little bit more challenging. I like the challenge. Because you're seeing so many different plumages in the birds, but the thing that's really interesting and you'll start to notice is like you'll see a bird and you'll say, I'm not sure what it is, but man, it really reminds me of that Cape May I saw in May in its full breeding plumage. And so many times those are those clues that will hint you to what the bird is. That phrase confusing fall warblers, while it was a great thing that Peterson did to show those plumages, to put that confusing title on that page, certainly makes it a little bit more challenging, and can sometimes make us feel a little intimidated when we're coming to those things. So let's start off with what I think is probably the easier group of fall migrants to identify, and that's birds of prey. So you can see we've got 4 major silhouettes on the screen, and I'm going to give you some of the features to look for. So when you're seeing a bird of prey in flight, you can pretty easily get it into a group pretty quickly by knowing how to look at proportions of birds and also how they fly. So in the on the upper left, you'll see kind of the small bird. It has fairly compact wings. And if you look at the length of the tail compared to the length of the body, they're about the same length. And that's classic for accipiters. So they have pretty short wings, long tails, and they're very flappy, glidey birds. So when I lead school groups at the tip of Point Pelee, I teach them the flap, flap, glide. So if I say sharp-shinned hawks, then all the kids flap, flap their wings, and then they glide. And that's the flight pattern that you'll see in an accipiter. So when we talk about accipiters, that's sharp-shinned, Coopers, and I guess it's American goshawk now. I have to get these new names in my brain. So those are the accipiters that we'll see, and I'll talk a little bit more about the timing of them. Below the accipiter, you see the really pointy winged bird, and I have a feeling a lot of people will say, oh, I know what that is. That's a falcon with those nice, sharp, pointy wings. I want you to look at the length of the tail compared to the length of the body. So on the accipiter, you can see they're about the same. In this one, the tail's not quite the length of the body. So if you go from the end of the, kind of from the rump to the end of the tail, it's about 2/3 the length of the body. And that's the proportions on your falcons. So typical falcons that we see at Pelee are American kestrel, Merlin, and peregrine falcon. In the upper right-hand corner, this is our classic Boodio. So this is where we're looking at things like red-tailed hawks, rough-legged hawks, broad-winged hawks, red-shouldered hawks. So you can see they have quite a broad wing, and the tail relative to the length of the body is quite short. It's about half the length and looks much wider, especially when they're in their flight. And typically you'll see them soaring much more than you see them flapping. And then finally, the last one we've got up is an eagle. This is a bald eagle, but you can see just the proportion of the wings compared to the rest of the bird. They just look like they have these giant, long, long wings compared to the body. So let's talk a little bit more about Sharpie versus Coopers. And this is one that I know befuddles people, and I have seen more arguments on the internet about, is this a sharp-shinned or is this a Cooper's hawk? And at this time of year, the majority of the birds that we see at Point Pelee are not sitting nicely in a tree where we can see all those great field marks to look for. What we're seeing are birds in flight. If you go to the Hawk Tower at Holiday Beach, same thing. These are birds that are flying over. You may not be able to see really well the field marks, but you can tell them apart in flight. So when we look at a sharp-shin, which is the one on the left, the things that you want to look for is that squared off tail. And, you know, sometimes they'll fan their tails out a bit, so they look a little bit rounder. But if you look at the edge of the tail, the corners are very squared. And then the other thing that I always think, it looks like sharp-shinned hawks are hunching their shoulders up. So if you look, the head doesn't really extend far beyond the front of the wings when they're flying. And so if you look at the Cooper's hawk, you can see like the head really extends out from the wings. They don't have that hunched up look. So when I talk about it, I always say sharp-shinned hawks look like a capital T and Cooper's hawks look like a lowercase t. I also think Sharpies look kind of like the shape of a garden wedge as well. And it makes a lot of sense for these birds to have these types of wings that aren't really, really long, because where they're breeding, they're flying through forests all the time. So if you have big, bulky, long wings, you're going to smack them into things all the time. So having these little bit more compact wings that you can kind of hunch up even too really allows you to get into some pretty tight places. And I've been almost hit in the head by enough accipiters at the tip when I've been walking interior trails when they're chasing blue jays or something to be really impressed with their maneuverability. So things to look for when they're in flight is length of the tail to the body. So it's the tail is the same length as the body, and they have the flappy glide. Now, I don't have goshawk up here because generally speaking, by the time goshawks are moving through Pelee, it's October, and you're almost not seeing any Sharpie or Coopers moving through unless they're ones that are going to be hanging out for the winter. The majority of the Sharpshin and Cooper's hawk movement is early on in the migration. And the way it kind of stages is right now we're in like Sharpshin hawk land, and it'll be like 1,000,000 Sharpshin hawks versus a few Cooper's hawks. And in about 3 weeks, that ratio switches and it's more Cooper's hawks than Sharpshin hawks. And the thing that can be challenging too, and size is so relative when you're looking at stuff, especially in flight. A female sharp-shinned hawk is going to be larger than a male sharp-shinned hawk. And so sometimes you can get a female sharp-shinned hawk and you can get a smaller male Cooper's hawk that can look pretty similar in size when they're in flight. So that's when you want to look for that. Do they have their wings hunched up, or do you really see that head protruding from the wings? Those are the things that I find are really makes it super easy to find them. And if you lie in a blanket in Sparrowfield, though, when I was doing that, there were not ticks everywhere. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but you can find a nice bench to lie on and watch as they go up and down the peninsula in the park. You'll really get to pick them out pretty easily after just a little bit of practice. So now we're going to talk about the bootios. So I think on the left is our classic red-tailed hawk, which I think this is probably the booty that most people are most familiar with. It's their roadside sitting on the fence post in the winter hawk in southern and in the summer in southern Ontario, especially. And they're often soaring, but the things you want to look for is you can see they have the dark armpits. So that's something that you're going to see, and the belly band. And again, younger birds aren't going to show a red tail, but they are going to show that belly band and the dark armpits. So that's one to look for. Broad-winged hawks, September's the month to see them in Ontario. They're going to move en masse, usually within a 2 to 3 day period. The majority of broad-winged hawks that are in Ontario will leave the province. It usually averages somewhere around 16th to 20th of September, kind of depends on the winds. But if you follow the hawk watch counts, you'll see the day where 300,000 broad-winged hawks have moved through this area. And and when you get to see it, like the photo below, that's a kettle of broad-winged hawks. And you'll see them just kettling up. And the term kind of comes, it looks like they're in almost like a witch's cauldron is how it was. I always thought of it as a kid, is like they're in the witch's cauldron and it's bubbling in the water currently. The heat is moving them up through this. And what they do on these thermals is when you get that differential between the land and the air temperature and heat rises, it will rise up in kind of these spiral thermals, and the birds just get on them and cruise all the way up till they get to the top, and then they just stream, what they call streaming off the top, and they just kind of shoot, and that warm air pushes them, and they get a really good boost in their migration. So when you're seeing the birds kettling during migration, that's what they're doing. They're using those heat thermals to help preserve some of the energy while they're migrating. So upper right-hand corner, that is our red-shouldered hawk. So this is the one that's gonna probably make you think it's an accipiter because they're a little trickier. Their tails always look a little longer and skinnier when they're flying. Um, we've all been faked out by this one before, but the thing to look for are the white kind of crescent moons in the wings and the barring in the tail. And then finally, we get northern rough-legged hawks, but typically we don't start seeing them showing up in my area until at least November. Often it's December before the migrants are arriving here. So it'd be probably a little different for you, Angie. You probably see them earlier than we do. But you always want to look for those little black spots on the light phased birds, and then the dark phased birds are pretty easy to pick out. They look all dark, but again, they have that rounded tail, it's about half the length of the body, and they're the ones to from a distance you can see them doing a hovering flight, and I don't know if anyone's seen them do this when they hunt. They'll hover very much like a kestrel hovers in flight over a field. So that's one way you can pick a rough-legged out from a distance, but you have to be careful in the winter because some red tails have learned how to do this. And we've seen this behavior sometimes pop up when there's both around. The other thing too is that if you see a big boodio sitting on a tree that looks impossibly small for it to support, it's probably a rough-legged hawk because they have very tiny feet and they can hold on to smaller branches than red-taileds can. So you'll see them on like these spindly little branches and they're fine, whereas a red tail would be like wobbling all over the place. And it's just because they have these feet that can grip tighter. All right, so let's talk about the falcons. I love falcons. They're one of my favorite groups of birds of prey. So we have on the left is our American kestrel, and this is really the time to see kestrels migrating. Again, because a lot of their diet is insects. This is one that will tend to move a little bit earlier in the season. We do have kestrels that overwinter here, or it's mild enough here. And they can, they can eat rodents and things, but we do see a lot of the push of kestrels through the area. So again, you can see they have the nice pointed wings, and this is the bird that has on the base of the wing, you'll see the string of pearls they often talk about on the falcon. So when it's flying, it has all these little white dots and it looks like a little string of pearls. And I always think they're just so dainty and the flight looks so effortless and they're almost, I always think of little fairies, but like vicious little fairies that can catch things and eat mice and stuff. But they just have this really light lilt to their flight. Merlins, if you see a bird with pointed wings that's going like 1,000,000 miles an hour, but it isn't big enough, way smaller than a crow, it's going to be a Merlin at Pelee. My dad always thought the wing looked like if you folded out a jackknife or a penknife, that blade shape, kind of rounded but pointed blade shape. They fly fast. I think they're my favorite out of these three because they're just these fierce little machines. And what I love about fall at Point Pelee is watching them chasing and catching dragonflies. It's just the aerial display between the dragonflies and the Merlin is just spectacular. So the things to look for on the Merlin is they, basically have pretty much a blue-gray body, streaking in the breast. They have mustache marks, but they're not defined like the peregrines are, not as defined as the pretty little kestrel is too. And then once we get later into the month of September and the first week of October is the best month to see peregrine falcons migrating through the park. This picture is a young falcon that was taken at the point. Just looking at it, like really interested. The young birds are a heck of a lot of fun to watch. They like to cause havoc all the time. They will go and chase all the gulls at the tip and chase all the shorebirds. They don't catch anything, they just go out there and just cause chaos. And then go back and sit in a tree for a while, and then they'll go out and cause some more chaos. And then they might catch a songbird while they're out there too. One thing that's really neat about peregrine falcons is they have the ability to eat on the wing. So this is a bird that if you're lucky, at least I think if you're lucky, you can actually see a peregrine eating its meal while it's flying. And I got to see this happen one time and it was really cool, but the group of people I was leading were not as excited about the event as I was, because it was a really cute little wood thrush that was being devoured on the wing by the peregrine. But they have a specialized hook inside their bill that allows them to go in and kind of snap the spinal cord of their prey. And so the bird might still be alive, but it can't move anymore. So it paralyzes its prey. And that's one of the reasons it can eat on the wing so easily. So when you're looking at peregrine falcons, you're looking for the big pointy wings. It's going to be a bird that's about the size of a crow, also fast flyers. And the other thing that's really neat about them too is that siblings tend to fly together during migration. And I had an interesting experience where we could hear peregrines calling back and forth to each other on either side of the point. So we were walking down a trail, and then on the woods there were peregrines on both sides of us, and they came together at the tip and caused a huge ruckus, and they were obviously moving together. And so I did a little bit of research, and it turns out that they found that siblings will, like from the same nest, will often fly and do that migration together. So that's something else you can look for with these guys. All right, and finally, the never-ending question about bald eagle versus golden eagle. And I'm sure at some point somebody's wondered, am I seeing a bald eagle or a golden eagle? So when they're adult birds, it's not that hard to tell the difference. You know, giant white head, big yellowy orange bill, white tail, adult bald eagle. Golden eagle is that all dark bird with the really golden nape. So one of the things you can look for is, what do they look like in flight? So when you look at a bald eagle, their wings look really flat. I always say they look like a surfboard, like one of those old wooden surfboards with kind of the rounded ends and super flat in flight. Golden eagles will always have a slight dihedral to them. And when you get the young birds, what you want to look for is the white on the body. And if you think about a bald eagle, the white's just kind of all over the place. It's not organized. It's not symmetrical. It just looks like somebody kind of went and whacked a bunch of white paint all over it. Whereas with a golden eagle, it'll have two white patches in the wings, similar to the patches that we saw on the rough-legged hawk, and it'll have a band of white across the tail. Looks very neat and organized. So I always say, is the white organized or just a chaotic mess? If it's chaotic, it's bald. If it's organized, it's golden. And a few other birds of prey that we will see moving through, obviously turkey vultures are on the move right now. I'm sure people are starting to see them moving through. We see kind of two pushes. We'll see a big push in early September, and then we tend to see another push of turkey vultures come through our area, usually around Thanksgiving. And what's neat about turkey vultures is if something like a Swainson's hawk is on the move, they tend to get in these big flocks of turkey vultures and moving with them as well. The other thing about turkey vultures, if you've ever watched a turkey vulture trying to fly after it's been roosting, they are not graceful flyers, but they are amazing gliders. And these guys can, like, if they get on a good thermal and get a good push, they can glide for over 200 kilometers without ever having to flap, which is pretty amazing. And they just have to adjust those long feathers that look almost like fingers, little bits and pieces to adjust their route, height, all of those kinds of things. So these are birds that are built to glide. We also see a lot of osprey moving through. Again, they tend to be earlier in the migration, but as our falls seem to be getting warmer and more drawn out, the ospreys will stick around until the food just isn't as good for them and they need to start moving south because of the temperatures. And then we also see northern harriers moving through on migration. We do have some that stay year round here. But harrier migration can be really late in the season. We've seen big movements of harriers on our Christmas bird count and had like 150 harriers move through the area in the middle of December. So fall migration really can be drawn out. And of course, I don't want to leave without talking a little bit about songbird migration. We're right in the thick of warbler migration right now. We're by the end of the month, most of the warblers will have moved through, depending on temperatures. We also see a lot of goldfinches at this time. They're the chip and dip birds, as I like to call them. They like chip and dip in their flight. It's like chip and then they dip. So they make a chip note and then they dip. So it's chips and dip. And then of course, if you've been in this area in the fall, you've probably seen the mobs of screaming blue jays. These guys are diurnal migrants. So they're migrating along the coastline like the birds of prey are. And they're loud and raucous. And what I think is one of the most interesting things that I found out about these guys is that through banding data that they've taken, the majority of the birds that are migrating are hatch year birds. So it's like all the adults have just said, I'm sick of you kids, get out, and then kick them all south. And to say that we see a lot of blue jays in this area is an underestimate. I've been on the Hawk Tower. I think my personal largest day was 33,000, went by Holiday Beach. And if you get to come to Pelee and see them when there's flocks, they'll just fly up and down the peninsula all day long. And they just scream and yell. And but you'll know when there's a bird of prey around because they'll all just dive into a tree. One will give the alarm call and they'll all dive into the tree. And then if you look up, usually you'll see a bird of prey around. Sometimes they do hawk drills, as my mom used to call them. One will scream and they all dive down and there's nothing there. But you will see this all the time and it's highly entertaining. Even if you aren't a birder, I've had more people who've come out like looking for monarchs and left just enamored with blue jay migration. So let's just take a peek at some warblers, because we all love confusing fall warblers. So I'm going to put it up, going to let you kind of think about it. You might say, oh, this is we often call these guys the bay poles because
breast.
Somebody's got it. Yes, it is bay breast. Well, so, and here's the other bay pole. And the hint to want to look for is this is the black pole. If you look at the feet, you can see the feet are a different color than the legs. And that's one of the really good features if you can see the feet in the fall to look for. Well, things like our black-throated green. Any guesses on this one? This is our Cape May. So if you look, you can see just the hint of that cheek patch that you're so used to in the spring. These guys just look so different in the fall. This is our chestnut-sided. And this one I also throws people for a bit of a loop, I find, and that's our common yellowthroat. And this is our magnolia. And this one's just as hard in the spring. And what I will tell you is the name is one of those names that you're like, why is it even called this? It's an orange-crowned warbler, but we do see lots of them. And then the yellow under the tail should be a good hint as to what this one is. Imagine it's wagging its tail up and down and up and down and up and down. There's our palm. And then finally, this little guy, you see just the hint of its little, the beret, and it's our Wilson's warbler. So there's lots around. What I really love about warbler migration though is, in the spring, some warblers are only in the park for a day. There'll be some days where you get warblers that'll hang around for 5 or 6 days. So you can go back and you can study them. And if you're there for a few days, you might find the same patch of warblers and be able to observe them. And if you're still kind of struggling with ID, it gives you more time to look at them. One thing I will say too is that if you can find a source of water in the fall, that can attract a lot of migrants. I had an experience where it had rained a lot and there was still water in one of the rocks on the rock wall at the tip, Pelee. And it was kind of just open a little bit and there was dogwoods around it. And while I was there, I had 20 species of warblers. And I just, you just sat and watched and one would come in and blah, blah, blah. And I ended up with 20 species and I didn't have to move. So, and that was just like, it was one of those really neat experiences and just having that little source of water available because, you're going to find if you go into some of the areas you're used to seeing that are quite wet in the spring, there's not going to be as much water there in the fall. So those little sources of water can be really important. So I can't talk about fall migration at Point Pelee without talking about monarch butterflies. I'm sure some people have seen monarchs at Pelee before. Others have wondered about monarchs at Pelee. So there have been stories for centuries about monarch migration. So by no means did anyone discover monarch migration. If you go back into indigenous stories, there's lots of them talking about monarch migration. But in 1975, the scientific community, and it was Dr. Frederick Hart out of the University of Toronto, he had started tagging monarchs and was able to find the wintering grounds in Mexico. And that was pretty significant find and kind of put the whole story together. So when you look at monarchs, this is I helped design this graphic because I found a lot of people had a hard time understanding monarchs and their migration. So we're going to start up with the blue in September. So the monarchs that are emerging right now are monarchs that are going to migrate. So what happens with them is the switch to become sexually mature doesn't turn on, is kind of the easiest way to describe it. So all of their energy at this time of year goes into building fat stores so that they can migrate. So the butterflies that leave here in the fall, you can see it takes them a couple months. They usually start to arrive in Mexico in early November. They will overwinter in those mountains in Mexico. And I know we've all seen the beautiful footage and photographs from Mexico. And they're in kind of a state of semi-hibernation. When it's cold, they don't fly, but on warmer days, you'll see them up and flying. As we start to get into January and February, they definitely start to become more active. And as we get into March and April, that's when those butterflies the switch gets turned on and they start to reproduce. So the butterflies that are leaving Mexico are reproducing and laying eggs on the first milkweeds that they find as they're heading back north. So the butterflies that leave Mexico, most of those will not make it into Ontario. They usually make it to around Texas, in that latitude in the northern Texas kind of area. And all of those eggs they've laid along the way those butterflies are the ones that will reach southern Ontario and kind of find the first milkweeds coming up in southern Ontario. Usually they start to see them in May into early June. And then there's at least 2 more generations, sometimes 3, before the ones are head back south. It really depends on the weather in the south, like the spring and summer. If it's a really warm summer, you might see an extra generation. If the summer gets really cool, it might slow down the development of those caterpillars. So I was reading the latest Monarch Watch newsletter, and they said they think migration might be a little bit delayed this fall because we had that little bit of cool weather in August. So those caterpillars may not go from egg to adult quite as fast as they normally do. Instead of taking 2 weeks, it might take them 2.5 weeks just because of those cooler temperatures. So that's kind of how it works. So the butterflies that leave here go all the way to Mexico, and then they're the ones that start the population relay race back north. So when we look at monarchs in North America, there's two populations of monarchs. There's Western and Eastern. So we're obviously part of the Eastern population. And all of the monarchs that migrate in the East all go to that one overwintering ground in Sierra Chincua Mountains of central Mexico. That's where they all go. And the ones that are west of the Rockies, they all go to basically it's along the Baja Peninsula where they overwinter. There's also a population of monarchs in North America in Florida that don't migrate. They're non-migratory. Kind of the thought is that they're probably ones that got blown off course during migration, and because there's milkweed available all year there, they just stop migrating. And if you look like the other monarch populations in the world, like there's monarchs on every continent but Antarctica, and all of them are not migratory like ours are. So the big concern with monarchs in North America is this, it's really losing the phenomenon of migration, not losing the species altogether. So you can just see this is kind of where they're are. So we do have a trilateral agreement between the US, Mexico, and Canada that works towards protection of monarchs. And one of the key things to do is protect the overwintering grounds. There's been challenges in Mexico with deforestation around the core sites where the monarchs go. So what has kind of happened is they've lost that insulating blanket. And if you get a real big cold snap, you're getting more die-off because there isn't that insulation of the forest around where they were. And also slash and burn agriculture is just reducing the amount of forest that's available to them. And then the other challenge between Mexico and here is just habitat loss. Honestly, not having milkweed to lay their eggs on, and just lack of pollinating flowers. So really habitat is key for the monarch migration. So you can see like in the late 1990s, early 2000s, the numbers were really strong. The way they count monarchs is by hectares, how many hectares the colonies cover is how they estimate the population. So last year was the second lowest number that they had ever seen in Mexico. We've seen like a couple blips up, but the numbers that we were seeing in the mid-90s compared to now are huge difference, from close to 20 acres down to almost 3. So it's really been a decline, and there's a lot of reasons for it. It's not just one thing, but there's a lot of concerted effort going on to help preserve the phenomenon. So the kind of everybody wants to know when to come to see them, and it's a really hard thing to predict because it's so weather dependent. But when we see cold air temperatures, rain or really strong winds off the lake, that prevents monarchs from crossing, and we'll start to see these numbers build up. So this is what a roost can look like at Pelee. In the evening, what you'll see is monarchs coming in on the trees, and they roost together. They do not fly as flocks. A lot of people seem to think they fly as a flock, but they do not. They each make their own independent decision, but they will group together in the evenings for warmth and also for protection. Because if you're with a bunch of other butterflies, you're less likely to be the one that gets eaten. same philosophy as school of fish and flocks of blackbirds. So when we're studying migration, we know a lot about bird migration. We know a lot about monarch migration now, but what about those dragonflies and bats? So let's talk a little bit about dragonfly migration. This one's always, it's been a bit more of a mystery. One thing that's been really neat is that we've been able to start geotagging dragonflies because they're big enough. A lot of the ones that, especially the ones that migrate, have enough bulk to them that you could put a small geotracker on them. This technology is actually opening up new doors. But one of the groups that's been studied is green darners. I'm sure people have seen green darners before. They're the big, kind of classic big green dragonfly. And what they've done is they've actually been able to use museum specimens from all over North America to figure out migration. And the way they do this is through the use of stable isotopes. So basically the stable isotopes, you can tell where something was born by the stable isotopes in the system. So they've been able to test this. And what they've discovered is that green darners basically have two reproductive strategies. And there's migratory green darners and non-migratory green darners. So there's a non-migratory generation that's in the south, which is kind of along the Gulf Coast, from November to February. And those dragonflies, that's where they live. Their whole lives is in that area. But their offspring, and they will reproduce, their offspring, that first generation, they'll migrate to the north. And then that generation overwinters in ponds. So up near you, Angie, is where they overwinter in the ponds. And they'll emerge next spring, and those ones are the ones that migrate south. So what the strategy allows them to do is they are reproducing kind of all the way up north and all the way down south. So if one pond disappears, they've put their eggs in a whole bunch of ponds going north and south. So it really ensures their ability to migrate. So the ones that I'll be seeing this fall are the ones that will have emerged kind of in northern Ontario in early spring, and they'll have started moving south. So it's pretty interesting. And just the fact that they've been able to use stable isotopes for museum specimens is pretty cool to figure that out. So things to watch for, the saddlebags. This is a black saddlebag, and if you look on the wing, it looks like they have almost like a bulky part on the wing. Looks like they're carrying luggage or bags. It's just black coloration on the wing. We get black saddlebags, red saddlebags, variegated saddlebags, and Carolina saddlebags. We see them all in the fall at Pelee. Also the 12-spotted skimmers, males and females, and of course the darner, like this one. And one of the things on a cool morning, the dragonflies will be roosting often on dogwoods at the tips. So if you can find if it's a nice, cool, calm morning, you may get to see them just all sitting along the edges of dogwood trees, and you can get some really good looks at them because they can't fly yet. They have to warm up enough to fly. And then of course we have our bats. So the first one is a hoary bat. We see red bats moving through. This is a tricolored bat, big brown bat. And then in this one, it's either eastern pipistrelle or little brown bat. I always forget the names, and silver-haired bat. And we see these guys all migrating at Pelee at this time of year. It's always fun in the evening, just when I have closed the park, I always get to see bats. And often if you're down at the tip first thing in the morning, check the little dark alcove in front of the women's washroom. If you've used the washroom at the tip of Point Pelee before, you know what I'm talking about. And often in that corner, there's bats roosting in there. So it's something to keep an eye open for. Now, silver-haired bats, they've been able to study them and start to put transmitters on them. So you can see the picture on the right is a little transmitter. And they've been able to determine by using these transmitters that there's essentially two waves of migration. You'll see a wave go through in late August and another one in mid-September. So being able to use these transmitters is really helpful. And the whole, we know how far they go. They go about 1,500 kilometers south of the North Shore of Lake Erie. And we've been able to study this with transmitters. And this is where MODIS really comes in. And this is a program that is tagging birds, bats, they've tagged some dragonflies. This small, like the big map, you can see all those little yellow dots are where there are MODIS stations. And you can see just the scattering of southern Ontario where there's MODIS stations. There's one at Hillman Marsh. There's one at Pelee that I hope it's going to get up and working properly again soon. But the idea is that anytime any of the birds or bats or whatever they've tagged goes near one of these MODIS stations, they'll ping off the tower, and then that ping will get recorded. And so it actually allows you to start tracking the movements. They've done some interesting things with swallows that they've tagged at Long Point, and you've seen them go across the lake and back as they're moving around in the fall in the roosts. And you'll see warblers doing that too and readjusting. So this technology is really allowing us to learn more and more about how birds are migrating. And because you have individuals, you're also learning, are the individuals going the same places in their overwintering and summering grounds, or are they changing locations? Because that can be really, really important when you're trying to work on conservation of a specific species. If you know that the overwintering ground, it's totally loyal to one spot and one spot only, but it has variable spots it goes to on the breeding ground, then that kind of the linchpin is going to be that overwintering habitat. So I guess what you can do to help, everybody always wants to know what you can do to help, is protecting habitat is probably the biggest thing in providing habitat for migrating species. Keeping cats indoors, I always like to give that message because cats kill so many things that it does have a big impact on the population. And also share your sightings. So the week of September the 13th, they're doing Canada-wide BioBlitz on iNaturalist through the Canadian Wildlife Federation. So I encourage you to send all your observations of plants and birds and butterflies and dragonflies and anything else you find with iNaturalist. Of course, keep e-birding. And the other place where you can share sightings, particularly of migrating animals, like they like to track hummingbirds, monarch butterflies especially. You can share those sightings on Journey North. So that brings it to an end. I've talked a lot. So I'm going to take my screen sharing off. If I can get my mouse to go back over to that screen.
Oh, but I like looking at that.
All right, well, you can still look at I'll let you look at the monarch for as long as you'd like to.
Sarah, I'm not familiar, I think, with Journey North. Is there like a website or an app?
Yeah, the website's pretty easy. It's journeynorth.org.
Journeynorth.org.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you, first of all. Thank you. That's.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Does anybody have questions? I'm going to ask a question first and then maybe, oh, there we are. Maybe people will have other questions. But what I'm wondering is with the monarch butterflies, when they lay their eggs on their journey north, like how long do the eggs take to hatch? How long until, and then they have to be a caterpillar. Like, how can they do this?
So the whole cycle from egg to adult is about a month.
Really?
Yeah. So they're in egg only for a few days. And then the caterpillars are generally about 2 weeks as a caterpillar to go from teeny tiny caterpillar to adult. and then they're in the chrysalis for about 12 to 14 days.
Neat. Bev has a question.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. That was great. Really looking forward to coming down at the end of the month. With the bats, the two different bat migration timings, was it just a silver-haired bat?
Yeah, that's the one where they know there's two distinct waves. Generally, what we see is the smaller, like what I've observed myself personally in the park is the smaller bat species tend to move through first, and then the larger ones are the ones that we see the latest. The ones I tend to see the latest are red bats, actually.
Okay. They haven't been able,
Because
sorry.
I've seen red bats even in November
Oh, okay. They
in the
haven't,
park in warm years. Yeah.
okay, they don't see an age difference like they do with birds migrating.
I don't know if they've really got into that. I know there's a group out of the University of Waterloo that's doing a lot of silver-haired bat work right now. So those are probably questions they're asking. I know they've been down trapping bats at Long Point, and I kind of want to get in touch with them and say, hey, I know where you might be able to catch them at Pelee if the resource conservation team is cool with it, because I think we'd be interested in learning information about more about silver-haired bats too.
Sure, thank you.
Corinne.
Yes, hi. Fascinating presentation. I'm really intrigued by the monarchs, but especially the dragonflies, actually. I've seen a few of them flying around where I live in Bolton. I was kind of curious. I know nothing really about this, but now I feel like I'm going to have to research this because I find it's kind of very intriguing to me. When you were talking about laying their eggs in ponds, can we see this? What do they look like? Are they like tadpoles' eggs, or they're smaller?
Well, yeah, if you take a look online, you'll be able to see some look up for dragonfly nymph,
Okay,
and they have a couple different stages.
okay,
And it's almost, I don't want to say it's like a tadpole, but it kind of is in terms of when they're first come out of the egg, they look a certain way and they go through some stages.
okay,
Well, they're ready to emerge as an adult. So you know how tadpoles are kind of start out with just a tail and then they start to grow their limbs.
right,
The dragonflies have different nymphal stages as well.
okay,
I know this just like I know exactly what to look for with them because I've done enough bug scoops at Point Pelee Marsh over the years with kids, is that I know what they look like. But if you look it up online, you'll be able to see
okay.
that. And if
Wow.
you have a pond near you
Yes.
and if you scooped up some water, sometime you might see dragonfly nymphs.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
like their dragonflies are pretty amazing predators. Which
Right.
you don't really think of them like that, but I've watched them with great pleasure in the fall catching stable flies at the tip. And if anyone has been bitten by a stable fly at Point Pelee, you would be cheering the dragonflies along with me. But they do, and even in their larval phase, they are eating other aquatic insects
Oh, yeah.
and other
Oh,
things
wow.
while they're underwater too. So
Oh, okay. Wow. Okay. Well, I'm definitely going to have to do research on that. Amazing presentation. Thank you so much.
oh, you're very welcome.
Yeah.
Usually when we have a meeting like this, I make announcements at the beginning, and I forgot about that until about half an hour before the meeting. So I didn't make announcements, but we should mention that the convention is coming up the end of the month, the last weekend of September. And there are 2 locations this year, one down at Leamington and one up in New Liskeard area, Hilliardton Marsh. There are still seats available at both. We'd love to see you there. It's going to be fun.
I'm doing my bird quiz.
Doing the bird quiz. Oh, and all of those who are logged in right now get 1 free answer. Is that right?
No. Because I haven't even written the quiz yet, so I can't give you a free answer.
Come on.
But maybe what we can do is pick the color that I'm going to use for my exciting what bird is this based on just the color, the certain color.
So hard.
I know everyone's like, I hate that one, but you love it at the same time. I always find it levels the playing field. I think I might go with yellow again this year.
I was gonna say yellow. Yellow is good.
So you guys now have the inside scoop. Start looking for any bird from any group that has yellow on it.
Study your field guide, people.
Yeah.
Study
You
your.
might have an advantage going into it, so.
I'm going to make the most fantastic trophy for Hilliardton that anybody has seen ever. I have stuff I bought, I just have to put it together now.
Excellent. Is it gonna beat my trophy?
Oh, good heavens, I think so.
I don't know. Mine is a ninja kicking person with birds on it, so. But anyways, having there is a trophy, so if you do come and do the bird quiz and your table's the winner, you guys get to take the trophy home. Oh, you've got a golf.
Got a golf trophy somebody donated to us.
Excellent. Well, I had the ninja trophy, so it'll be great. We'll have one for each place. So yeah, it should be a lot of fun, and I hope that people are going to be able to come out and join us at either of the conventions, because the field trips are going to be fantastic. Our presentations our keynote speaker is going to be a lot of fun and interesting, and I think we always have a good time. So
It's a good time. It always is. So anyway, I will say, Sarah, thank you so much. And
you're
everybody,
very welcome.
we're back the first Wednesday of October, and I forget what it is. Does anyone remember? It's good though. It's gonna be good. They're all good. So we'll see you back in October if we don't see you at the convention. Thanks for coming out tonight. Drive safe home from your computer.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Sarah, that was awesome. Thank you again.
Oh, you're very welcome. If you want to put the presentation on the Google Drive and send me the link, I'll get it up on YouTube on the weekend.
Yep, I'll do that. It'll take me about probably 2 hours from my computer to deal with it. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's just I'll have time on the weekend to get that back up. So then, I'll put it up that it's up on our social pages, and then maybe it'll drive a little bit more. I'll do a convention reminder post and
Yeah.
say, here's teasers to what you might find. So
Yeah, and some of those things we'll find up north too, and some of them we won't, but.
yeah. All right.
Night all.
Night, everybody.
I should stop.